Everything is on the table. Those were the words of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on February 24th as he revealed that the Great White North is planning to step up a gear in the Ukraine war. This is big. Canada is preparing to screw Russia, and best of all, it's doing it with Russia's own money. The US is shocked at Canada's power play. But what exactly is Canada preparing to do? And what impact will the country's decision for Ukraine have on the war? It all starts with a pledge. On February 24th, dozens of world leaders came together for a peace and security summit held in Kyiv. Trudeau was among the dozens, and he made a massive announcement to mark the third anniversary of Putin starting his special military operation. $5 billion in aid. This is not a conflict Ukraine wanted, provoked, or asked for in any way, said Trudeau at the summit table. These remarks appear to be a direct response to US President Donald Trump. "You should have never started it," Trump roared in a Truth Social post earlier in February, appearing to echo Russia's claims that Ukraine started the three-year war with Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin himself made the claim in February 2024 during an interview with Tucker Carlson. "It was they who started the war in 2014, Putin told Carlson. "Our goal is to stop this war, and we did not start this war in 2022. Those were odd claims to make given that Russia invaded Ukraine, with Putin justifying his actions by claiming that he wanted to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Canada has just outright rejected that idea. And in doing so, it also rejected Trump's recent claims that Zelensky started the Ukraine war. "This is a war that started for one reason and one reason only: Russia's desire to erase Ukrainian history and expand their empire," said Trudeau at the Kyiv summit. It's for that reason that Canada is prepared to send $5 billion in aid to Ukraine. But here's the best part. None of that money is actually coming from Canada directly. Instead, Canada will use the funds seized from Russian assets that have been frozen in the Great White North since Putin started his war. Ukraine is finally going to be able to fight against Russia using Russia's own money, and it gets worse for Putin. $5 billion isn't the limit of what Canada can provide to Ukraine via Russia's frozen assets. It's just the first installment of revenues generated from those assets. For several years, Canada has been promising to forfeit all holdings associated with Russia's oligarchs and its government to Ukraine. It's also pushed for Europeans to do the same with the Russian assets they have frozen in their accounts. At the very least, those countries should be delivering the interest generated by those assets to Ukraine, Canada claimed. In short, there's more coming. Canada's $5 billion, though a massive sum in its own right, is just a drop in the bucket of the $300 billion worth of sovereign Russian assets currently frozen in Western banks. That $300 billion accounted for around half of Russia's total reserves of $612 billion held in foreign currency and gold as of December 2023. Canada controls a not insignificant amount of those assets. Reuters says Russia currently holds $19 billion in Canadian dollars. That means that Canada still has over $14 billion in frozen Russian assets that it could distribute to Ukraine. This also assumes that the $5 billion being donated now comes directly from the frozen assets. It's possible that some of the money was generated via interest, meaning that Canada may have even more than the $14 billion left to give. We also mentioned that Canada is pushing Europe to follow its lead and start using its frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. It isn't alone in that call. One day before Trudeau's announcement, Estonia launched its own renewed push to convince its fellow European Union or EU members to do the same. The Baltic country sent a discussion paper to its EU partners on February 23rd and had plans to raise it in a meeting held on the same day that Trudeau made his announcement. The decision to use the windfall profits was a step in the right direction, claimed Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna, when referring to Europe using the interest generated by the frozen Russian assets it holds to help Ukraine. "I see that the time is ripe now to take the next step." What would the next step look like? Handing over all of the Russian assets Europe currently holds to Ukraine. The vast majority of Russia's frozen assets are held in European and British banks. Russia has invested $207 billion of those frozen $300 billion in the euro. If EU countries release that money, it would almost double the $138.58 billion it has already allocated to Ukraine since Putin started his war. The UK could get in on the act too. Russia holds around $37 billion in British pound assets, which might also be released to bring the total from Europe up to $244 billion. That would be a massive hit in Putin's imperialistic ambitions. Trudeau's and Estonia's calls to use those assets more effectively are currently being ignored. That won't matter to Ukraine right now. It's about to receive a $5 billion influx that it can dedicate it to its growing domestic arms industry. By 2024, about 500 arms producers were operating in Ukraine, employing 300,000 people in total. Canada's donation of frozen Russian assets will have a huge impact on research and development for those arms producers, which ultimately means the creation of more weapons Ukraine can use to defend itself against Russia. That will come as a major shock to Putin. 3 unnamed sources told Reuters that Putin had his own plans for the frozen $300 billion. He was willing to concede the money, the sources said, but he would only do so if the cash was used for the reconstruction of Ukraine after his war ended. How magnanimous of Russia's leader, right? Not so much. The sources also said that Putin would insist on the money only being used to rebuild the parts of Ukraine that Russia holds. In other words, Putin is assuming that any peace talks he holds with Ukraine will result in Russia gaining Mariupol and large portions of the Donetsk region, with what he sees as his money only being dedicated to the rebuilding efforts in those regions. Ukraine wouldn't get a dollar. It's unknown if Putin's ideas for the frozen funds were discussed when he held his meeting with Donald Trump in Saudi Arabia in mid-February, but if they were, Canada's decision will be a major shock to the US system. How is Trump supposed to be able to guarantee that Putin can use his frozen assets to rebuild if those assets are being sent to Ukraine to fund its war effort? While the US contends with that issue, Trudeau wasn't done with his announcements. While the delivery of $5 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine was the Canadian headline at the Kyiv Peace Summit, Trudeau had plenty more up his sleeve. Ukraine isn't just receiving Russian money. It's also getting vehicles and a grant from Canada. We don't yet know much about the grant, other than it will be used to help Ukraine improve its energy security amidst Putin's constant attacks on the Ukrainian power grid. Those attacks have been a hallmark of Putin's approach to his invasion throughout 2024. He launched a massive strike involving 16 missiles and 13 drones on Lviv and Zaporizhia in June 2024, which managed to damage equipment in the former and wounded 2 energy workers in the latter. That strike was the 8th attack against Ukrainian infrastructure launched in 3 months, according to Ukraine. The attacks kept ramping up. The following months saw more Russian missiles and drones battering Ukraine's power grid, culminating in Russia's 12th assault on the Ukrainian grid in a year on December 13, 2024. That attack took place when temperatures in Ukraine had reached a freezing 21.2 degrees Fahrenheit and involved 93 missiles and almost 200 drones. Ukraine's air defenses managed to shoot 81 of the missiles down, with 11 being taken out by Ukraine's F-16s, but that still meant a dozen got through, along with some of Russia's drones. The mention of Ukraine's freezing temperatures hints at why Putin is carrying out these attacks. He believes that taking out Ukraine's electricity generating capacity will make life hell for the country's citizens, and he's right. Russia's energy grid assaults have already destroyed about half of Ukraine's generating capacity, along with some of its distribution systems. Long blackouts and lack of access to heating are the results. Putin wants to cripple morale in Ukraine with these terroristic attacks that impact the country's citizens. Canada's grant should help Ukraine as it rebuilds and develops more defenses to keep its power grid safe. As for the donated vehicles, Trudeau used the Kyiv summit to pledge 25 of Canada's LAV-3s to Ukraine. These light armored vehicles look like mini tanks, and they'll give Ukraine plenty of mobility and firepower on the battlefield. They can reach top speeds of 62 miles per hour, over a range of 280 miles before requiring refueling. And the LAV-3 is also capable of crossing 6.5-foot trenches, which will be important to Ukraine given Putin's reliance on trench warfare tactics. Each vehicle is armed with an M242 Bushmaster 25mm cannon, along with a secondary 7.62mm coaxial machine gun that fires standard NATO rounds. Ukraine also has the option of adding 76mm smoke grenade discharges that are useful for evasive maneuvers, along with a Mag-58 turret-top machine gun to further boost the LAV-3's firepower. Thermal sights are built into the periscopes and viewing ports available to the vehicle's driver, commander, and gunner, making the LAV-3 just as impactful at night as it is during the day. Add all of this to an integrated GPS and digital compass system, VHS and Harris high-frequency radios, and an automatic warning system designed to counter the most common battlefield laser threats, and you get a very powerful vehicle. On top of that, Canada is also going to provide a pair of combat support vehicles to Ukraine. It'll also facilitate training for those vehicles, along with the LAV-3s, in Germany so Ukraine's troops can make the most of them. We also mentioned how Ukraine used its F-16s to shoot down Russian missiles earlier. Canada is going to help with that as well. Trudeau promised Canada would also donate a landing system for Ukraine's F-16 fighters, along with 4 flight simulators designed around the jets. Those simulators will prove vital for helping Ukraine train more of its pilots to fly the 61 F-16s that have been promised to it by several of its European partners. Ammunition, first aid kits, and drone camera components are also among the impressive military aid package Canada has promised to Ukraine, in addition to the $5 billion in frozen Russian assets. Trudeau also promised that Canada would continue training Ukraine's troops so they could defend the Western-led world order against Russia's invasion. All of these are signals that Canada is going to do everything it can to support Ukraine. Think about what this means from Trump's perspective. America's president has already developed a contentious relationship with Canada. Even before he became president, Trump was claiming that Canada should become the 51st US state. He's also disrespected Trudeau constantly, referring to him as governor rather than prime minister at every opportunity. Those comments have been passed off as jokes and non-starters in most quarters, but they offer insight into how Trump views one of America's closest allies. Trump has also threatened Canada with tariffs. Though he agreed to pause those tariffs in early February as a response to Canada increasing its border security, the rhetoric has started again. The month-long pause is coming to an end, with Trump claiming that the tariffs are going forward on time. On February 24th. If implemented, the US will rock Canada with a 25% tariff on most of the goods it exports to the US. Trump claimed that Canada has taken advantage of the US for too long during a White House news conference that included France's President Emmanuel Macron. This is an abuse that took place for many, many years. The tariffs will go forward, yes, and we're going to make up a lot of territory, said Trump. Of course, we also can't forget that Trump is trying to position himself as the arbiter of peace in the Ukraine war. He's already held the previously mentioned discussions with Putin in Saudi Arabia, cutting Ukraine out of the equation altogether. He's blaming Ukraine for supposedly starting the war, and he's even gone so far as to call Zelensky a dictator. He also refused to label Putin the same way during the White House press conference with Macron, suggesting that he favors Russia's side of the story ahead of Ukraine's side. Canada unfreezing $5 billion in Russian assets to send to Ukraine, along with its latest military aid package, shows us that Trudeau is biting back. While Trump seems to increasingly support Putin, Canada is heading in the opposite direction. It's betting on Ukraine. And it's doing everything it can to screw Russia. If it was just the money and light armored vehicles that Trudeau discussed on February 24th, that would be enough to worry Putin. It would show him that Ukraine is retaining an extremely important ally during a time when that ally is under pressure from the United States. But there's more, much more. Trudeau is actively questioning how the United States is approaching peace negotiations for the Ukraine war. We cannot return to an era where might makes right, Canada's Prime Minister said at the Kyiv summit. We must do everything in our power to enable Ukraine to secure a just and lasting peace, a peace that cannot be achieved without Ukrainians at the table. By now it's obvious that Trudeau is referring to the Saudi Arabia meeting between Putin and Trump. Again, Canada is outright opposing America's strategy for dealing with Russia. It's also committed to helping Ukraine secure a form of peace that's favorable to the country. Once a just peace is secured, Canada stands at the ready to work with our partners around the world to provide Ukraine the security it needs for the peace to last, allowing it to recover, rebuild, and prosper, added Trudeau. In other words, Canada doesn't believe a ceasefire is enough. It's also not going to allow Russia and the US to arrange a version of peace that favors Putin. Canada will continue to arm Ukraine. The moment to stop this war of aggression, the moment to defend democracy, the moment to stand for our shared values is now, Trudeau declared. Again, another shock to the US system. As Trump decries Zelensky as a dictator, Canada's Prime Minister lauds him as a defender of democracy. This isn't how Putin's ideas of might making right were supposed to go. He believed that getting the US on his side even a little bit would help him secure a version of peace that favors Russia. Canada has just positioned itself in the direct opposition to that type of peace, which is a massive boon for Ukraine. Perhaps Canada's approach is already having an impact on Putin. Also on February 24th, news emerged that Putin is no longer opposed to allowing European involvement in the peace negotiations he's holding with Trump. Putin didn't specify whether Ukraine could still be involved. Still, it's a step forward. Their participation in the negotiating process is needed, Putin said when referring to the continent his special military operation threatens. We never rejected that. We held constant discussions with them, Putin added. He also defended the Saudi Arabia meeting, claiming that any peace would have to start with Russia and the US making the first step. Ukraine was never mentioned. But the suggestion seems to be that more parties willing to fight on Ukraine's side will soon enter peace discussions. There's one more little aspect of Trudeau's appearance at the Kyiv summit that we've yet to discuss. Do you remember the quote we used at the start of the video? "Everything is on the table," said Trudeau. That comment didn't come in reference to Canada unfreezing $5 billion of Russian assets or its delivery of a new round of military aid to Ukraine. Instead, it came after Trudeau was asked a simple question by reporters: is Canada willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine? That question didn't differentiate between whether those boots would be part of a peacekeeping force or a Canadian military fighting alongside Ukraine, but to Trudeau, that distinction doesn't seem to matter. We're going to have to continue to do more and more in an uncertain world, and Canada will be there, Trudeau said in response. As to how we will be there, we will work with our neighbors on it, but everything is on the table because we need to make sure that might no longer makes right in this world. What you don't hear anywhere in that quote is Trudeau saying, no, Canada won't send troops into Ukraine. Has Trudeau just pledged Canada's army to Ukraine if it's needed? Not quite. But as Trudeau says, everything is on the table. If Canada does get directly involved in the Ukraine conflict, whether as a fighting or peacekeeping force, it delivers the world's 28th strongest military, according to aggregator Global Firepower. Canada has 68,000 active military personnel, along with 27,000 in reserve. These aren't massive numbers considering the meat grinder that Putin has created in Ukraine. However, Ukraine will happily take what it can get, especially as many of Canada's soldiers are well trained and have taken part in NATO-led military operations in the past. Canada also has a stock of 351 aircraft, including 66 fighter jets and a tanker fleet of 6 planes that Ukraine could use to refuel its aircraft while they're still in the air. Canada's stock of military vehicles is also impressive, as it could bring over 21,700 to the fight. Plus, it has a navy totaling 73 assets with a tonnage of 119,637. That navy includes 4 submarines and 12 frigates, all of which Ukraine could put to good use against Russia via the Baltic Sea if Canada put fighting boots on the ground. Of course, the possibility of Canadian boots on the ground doesn't equate to a certainty. Trudeau hasn't confirmed whether his country's soldiers will enter Ukraine. But he's not shying away from the chance that it could happen, and his comments come as Trump claims that Putin is apparently willing to allow a European peace force into Ukraine. He will accept that. I've asked him that question, Trump claimed during his White House press conference with Emmanuel Macron. Look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for more war. I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it. If Trump is accurate, Putin's acceptance of European troops in Ukraine will be a massive U-turn in Russian policy. Previously, even a peacekeeping force has been described as an escalation by Putin. Now it's supposedly an idea that Russia is willing to get behind, at least according to Trump. Maybe the future will see that European peace force being supplemented by Canadian troops. We'll have to wait and see. For now, Canada is screwing Russia by making it clear just how far it's willing to go to support Ukraine. Using $5 billion in frozen Russian assets to provide more aid to Ukraine stings Putin. So does the announcement that Canada is providing yet another military aid package outside of its $5 billion, along with a grant to support Ukraine's power grid. But perhaps most worrying of all for Putin is that his hope that America's pressure on Canada would benefit him isn't being realized. Canada still stands defiant against Russia. That will only benefit Ukraine as Putin's invasion moves into its 4th calendar year. But what do you think about Canada's decision to unfreeze Russian assets and solidify its support of Ukraine? How will it affect the Ukraine war? How will Trump react? And might we see Canadian boots on Ukrainian soil sooner rather than later? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.